So welcome everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join our webinar today. So this is part 2 of what was supposed to be 3, and we've had to unfortunately cancel our presentation tomorrow, but we're looking to get that rearranged pretty soon. So this is presentation 2 of our annual seminar series. So this is on behalf of the CIWEM Central Southern branch. We usually have an annual seminar every year, and obviously due to COVID we're unable to host that, so we're hosting this instead. And the theme of this is Coasts in a Changing Climate. So before I let the speakers introduce themselves and get started, just a few things to advertise on behalf of CIWEM. So similar to this seminar, the annual Flood and Coast Conference is going to be hosted as a series of webinars, and that is open for booking now. I believe we're going to share some of the links in the chat box below. There's a few things open that people can apply for at the moment, including the Margaret's bursary for urban drainage design for early career professionals. That shuts on the 23rd of October, and that's for up to £3,000 bursary. Similarly, there's the Young Environmentalist of the Year awards that shuts on the 30th of October. And there's the UK Junior Water Prize, which shuts in February. So I believe the links are all being shared at the moment to those if they're of interest to you. Just a note about today, the webinar is being recorded and will be available online at a later date. We'll share that round. We have a Q&A box, so any questions you may have, we're going to address them at the end, but feel free to type them as you think of them. And we'll go through those at the end. If you're having any technical queries, the chat box is the place to put those, and we'll see if multiple people are having the same issue. I believe, Jane, have you stopped sharing screen at the moment? Possibly the screen's disappeared.
Yeah, I took down the holding slide to get ready for the presentation.
Okay, yeah. So I think that's it from me. So if I hand over to, we've got Kevin and Greg today hosting the presentation. If I let them introduce themselves, and yeah, then we'll make a start.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Kevin Burgess. I head up the coastal group at Jacobs. And I've been involved with shoreline management planning and so on for about the past 30 years. And co-presenter today is Gregor Guthrie, who's semi-retired from Royal Haskoning. I don't think he'll ever properly retire, but again, has a good 30 plus years of shoreline management experience. I'm a bit apprehensive because the internet went down 2 minutes before this started, so hopefully you can still hear me, but we'll see how it goes. Thanks for joining everybody today. Greg and I have been invited to talk about shoreline management plans, something we've been heavily involved with for a long time. A little bit of background to them, and thinking to the future, just off the back of a project we've recently been undertaking. So we weren't sure how many people on the call would be familiar with what a shoreline management plan is, and this sets out a few of the principles on this particular slide. The original idea came from about 1992, when MAF, who was a forerunner to DEFRA, set out their strategy for the coast and the environment. And the concept of a shoreline management plan was to look at the best approaches to managing risks from flood and coastal erosion. And it was all in the basis of avoiding, it says here, as far as possible, tying future generations into inflexible and expensive options for defence. And this was off the background of a recognition that a lot of works around the coast were done in a very piecemeal fashion. And of course, coastal processes don't respect administrative boundaries, and the effects of what you do on one part of the coast can have significant effects elsewhere. So the whole point was to take that account of those interrelationships that exist around the coast. And although these are long-term plans, the original ones were setting the direction for the next 50 years and the following ones for 100 years. It wasn't really about trying to tell future generations what to do. It was really very much about having a vision and a target of where we were trying to go to for sustainable shoreline management, and really making sure that we weren't doing things today that were going to be detrimental to the long-term ambition. So The first generation plans were done mostly through the 1990s, but we got to about the year 2000, and it was recognised that there was still a lot to be done. There was an awful lot of political statements in a number of them. Certainly the likes of Greg and myself went to many a meeting with local councillors where they said, we shall only hold the line here, you shall say nothing else. And there was a recognition that needed to be looked at a little bit more objectively. And the second generation was produced from about 2006 onwards, building on the originals. And we'll talk about that later. So could I have the next slide, please? So most recently, Jacobs and Royal Haskoning DHV have just completed a project which has been called the SMP Refresh. And again, more about that later. But essentially, there's 22 SMPs covering the coast of England and Wales, and that project has been focused on the English ones, which are 20, of which 2 are cross-border with Wales. Although NRW are about to commence the Welsh ones as well. So what we're going to talk about today is sort of where we've come from, why we've got these plans, what we've done, and how to take them forward, and just tail off with a discussion of broader issues. So these plans were all based upon guidance that was produced in about 2006. And if I could have the next slide, please. The 2006 guidance and the way SMPs were developed started to take a broader perspective than maybe the original SMPs had. However, and this is perhaps quite important, people think shoreline management plans are cover a lot more than what the remit actually is. A lot of people think there are integrated coastal zone management plans, for example, and they're not. The SMP does not, at least at the moment, set policies for anything other than coastal defence and risk management. But increasingly, we've seen pressures from society, we've seen changes with regard to the climate and other things. And obviously, you cannot make decisions for the coast and coastal defence without taking account of all of these other factors. What's happening with local industry, the natural environment, the people, the culture, and so on and so forth. So what we've done in the refresh is start to look at how we may take account of the information coming from those particular themes. So we'll come on to that again a little bit later, but I think first of all, we're just going to take a step back and I'll hand over to Greg to think about how to get to where we are now.
I think when we started the refresh, one of the key questions was why not SMP3? You know, we've done 1, we've done 2, why not just go ahead and do SMP3? And I think to answer that question, we have to sort of look at what we were trying to achieve and what we have achieved. And my starting point for everything is Coast Protection Act in 1949. Up until that time, interestingly, it had been very much almost public prescription, local funding, and the 49 Act introduced partnership funding, bringing in government funding. It was a massive step forward because there was also just a lack of planning. And there's this lovely expression in the memorandum with the Act that says, taking time by the forelock. And it also introduced a more collaborative approach, but it was still very much focused on local defences. So a very local perspective. And I think the big step forward in shoreline management plans was taking that longer, broader perspective. So predicting the future change in the coast, looking at risk in a bigger way and assessing strategic options, really trying to get ahead of the game, using time to actually plan, so that Jacques Duvivier's concern that, you know, everything is driven by reaction, is we move away from that. SMP1 was a bit of an experiment. It was a big step forward, even down to how do you divide the coast up to make sure that you've got specific guidance without losing that bigger picture? And the way in which that went about, we defined units, we then looked at how we're managing it, can we keep it going, and then defining policy from that. But alongside that, at the same time, 1992 was the big push towards coastal zone management, recognizing that risk management, which almost inevitably is focused on the now and tends to be a fairly rigid thing, it's how do we protect what is there, against coastal management, which is obviously the statutory development plans, catchment management plans, biodiversity action plans. Yes, they were around in 1992, not just out of the Environment Act now. And also at that time, they were talking about coastal zone management plans. If you click on the web and look for coastal zone management, you will actually get directed to shoreline management plans, which is interesting. Because shoreline management plans is more about the way in which we manage risk, but trying to provide that bridge between risk management and coastal management. As we've, really trying to look forward, understanding where we want to go. But from the SMP perspective, it was still anchored a bit to defences. Typical defence life, 50 years. Therefore, let's plan forward 50 years with a can we keep it going attitude. SMP 1 was reviewed to see whether it was working. And that led to SMP 2 with more emphasis on links to the planning system, the broader environmental impacts, and looking at even longer term. So instead of chopping the coast up, it was a case of looking at the whole coastline, supported by the Future Coast work that looked at long-term behaviours, and then starting from what drives our management and what will drive our management at a local and regional level, looking at those interactions and interdependencies across the whole area, and only then coming up with a plan that for how we want to manage. And in doing this, also looking at 100 years, but not just what do we do up until year 100 and then nothing, but where do we need to be in the future in order to keep sustainable management going? And how do we get there from where we are at the moment? So in the 206 guidance, very much about a continuing and continuous process, with the distinction being made between the plan and policies. The plan is what the SMP is delivering. The policies are the way in which the plan will be delivered. Also, taking this very much as a starting point from where we are now and how we need to go. So we don't want to redefine that thought. We don't want to every 10 years come up with a new vision for the future. And the SMP process was very much about revitalizing the progress that had been made. So that hopefully gives some background, and I'll hand back to Kevin to actually run through how we've approached it and what we've done. Kevin? Hello?
Oh, have we lost him? Apologies for this.
Yeah, I think Kevin Kevin is maybe having some internet difficulties at the moment.
Are you able to carry on his absence, Greg?
I can carry on in his absence.
Thank
yes.
you.
So we started from where SMP2s were what we wanted from them. Promote sustainable management over the next century and beyond, providing a timeline, and considering this in terms of policies, short term, medium term, and longer term. And that really defines the framework. If this will click on. It wasn't that SMP2 was wrong. We started from the aspect that the plan was still a sensible plan, but we recognized that there was new information, new knowledge, different legislation, and changing attitudes. And if you do come back, Kevin, do feel free to leap in and alter what I'm saying. There are also, we recognize some legacy issues. So in some areas, SMPs were driven by politics, and therefore we had to check that the plan was actually still sustainable, that we weren't actually getting problems creeping out. So I will click on. So it takes almost as long to click. There we are. I think this sustainability, one of the key things is obviously funding. And we have to recognize that with sea level rise, you know, various studies have looked, and if you take the high emissions, then into the future, we could be expecting costs of up to 8 times what we're doing now. The SMP is about change. In some areas, it's hold the line all the way through. But in a lot of areas, there is this need for change. And therefore, one of the key aspects of the refresh is, have we actually taken the steps that we needed to take in the short term to get us to be Epoch 2 ready?
Hello, Greg, I've managed to rejoin.
Right, I will hand over. I think I'm virtually at the end of this slide.
Thank you. Yeah, and I missed what you said to the last 2 slides, but I can assume that was you covered exactly what I was going to cover. So I just picked up the end there. It said, as Greg said, are we Epoch 2 ready? And that's quite a fundamental thing, which we'll touch upon in a moment. But yeah, there's a lot of things which really still need to happen. So we can go to the next slide, please. Right. So what we're trying to do in the refresh project is obviously looking at re-energizing the whole SMP process. There's no question that some were being very actively managed, whilst there are others which are probably sat on the shelf for a number of years. Also over the years, the way in which people have looked at them have diverged to some extent, and with the advent of things such as coastal strategies, we've certainly seen that there are some groups where they think the strategies just simply supersedes the SMP, which actually is not necessarily correct. There are some people who've come new to their roles with risk management authorities, with environment agencies and local authorities, who weren't around at the time of developing the SMP and aren't necessarily that familiar with what's in there either, and what they contain. So we're certainly looking to re-energize them, remind people of what they are and what they're supposed to be, and get a degree of consistency going forward in the future. Oops, sorry, can you just go back one? No, that's it.
Yeah.
We've got to be what we've tried to do, and Greg and myself and our colleagues, is we've tried to think about how do we move the SMP from just being a document which may collect dust on the shelves or sit somewhere at the darkest corner of the internet, such that they can become living, not living documents, but living entities.
Process.
Yeah. So we're looking at this the iterative process with the SMPs and shoreline management going forward. And part of that has been to look at a framework to help make this happen. So if we could go to the next slide, please. The SMPs themselves, as was a couple of slides back, were primarily looking at management factors set over 3 epochs. Epoch 1 being the first 20 years, Epoch 2, the medium term, which is roughly the next 30, and then Epoch 3, which is 50 years on. But in all cases, we've got a present situation and we've got a target. The target being this intent of management that Greg has already sort of spoken about. So we can think about where are we at the moment, where we're trying to get to, and critically, how are we going to get there from A to B? So just next slide, please. And we can start to think about that in terms of the epochs as well. And the little box at the top there is a summary of the SMPs where there's a policy change or a policy transition. And as you can see from that list there, the HTL means hold the line, MR means range realignment, NAI is no active intervention. So there are many locations, and there's, to be precise, there's 1,536 policy units around the English coastline. In existing SMPs, there's already 260 odd where it's expected to be a transition from one policy type to the next in Epoch 2. So for example, moving from hold the line to managed realignment or no active intervention. So there's an awful lot of transition that's got to take place, and hence this question, as we approach the end of Epoch 1, Epoch 2 starts in a few years' time, in 2025. Are we actually ready? Are we ready for that? How are we going to make that transition? So maybe next slide, please. So what we're trying to do with the refresh is set up this new framework, as well as all of the other things we're doing within the refresh, which helps facilitate that move from the present to the target. We've defined the refresh period really as being the next few years. From now, maybe up to and over the next decade, certainly spanning the end of Epoch 1 and the start of Epoch 2, to get Epoch 2 ready so we can start to implement and make those changes. But the other thing is critically is thinking about how to make those changes and what are the criteria for them. And we've again looked at a triggers-based approach to doing this. So starting to think about setting triggers and measuring against those as for when the transition needs to take place, rather than this very broad statement of it will be Epoch 2, which could be any time over a 30 or 40 year period. Could we
Have you disappeared again, Kevin?
I was just wondering if that was just me or not. I think he may.
Oh, yeah, I don't hear audio for Kevin.
Sorry about this. Greg, are we able to?
Yes.
Pick up. Sorry.
Oh, I'm back.
Oh, he's back.
Yep. This is dreadful. So it just seems that today the internet is giving me all sorts of. I've just got a message saying your internet connection is unstable. Really, that's very helpful. So, I'm going to. I haven't put a booster in yesterday. So, as far as the framework goes, it's not a fundamental appraisal of the SMP policies. We're not abandoning the epochs, but we're trying to produce this new delivery framework. So maybe you just go to the next slide, please. Hello?
Yep. Yes.
Yep. Okay, thanks. Right. I'm literally now standing about 1 foot from the router in my house. So what we look to do during phase 1 of the project which is what we've recently completed, is produce this framework for moving forward, so we can take the SMPs forward. But the other key things that we've produced is we've done a review of how changes since the development of the SMPs might be accounted for. So touching on one of the earlier slides that Greg did on my behalf, was we know there have been changes in legislation, there's been changes in attitudes, there's new information which has arisen. We've looked across about 10 key areas, which have included development planning, climate change, natural environment and legislation there, to see how might the SMPs need to be updated or just reviewed to say, has this had an effect on the policies that were set 10 to 15 years ago? So we've produced some guidance on how to do this, but they accompany a health check that's been produced for each SMP. So we've been around the country talking to every SMP group, looked at every SMP, and then applied a series of checks, which I think is on the next slide.
Right, sorry.
Oh, sorry, actually, no, let's skip that one, given problems.
Right.
Yeah. So we've carried out health checks for all of the SMPs with a series of,
Whoops, sorry.
That's all right. Go back.
Yeah.
I'll stick with this. Let's go on.
There we are.
So we've carried out a series of tests which have been round looking to see whether, since the SMP was produced, there's been any changes in the applied policy. Although the SMP says one thing, have people been doing something different? Was the policy qualified in some way or another, for example? Were there, although there's a headline policy which says hold the line, sometimes the small print says, but only if private funding can be found, or only if certain things are done, this, that, and the other. Then we've looked at physical factors, funding requirements, planning, natural environment, as I say. So looking at every one of those SMPs and applying those tests, we've identified where a further look is recommended at certain policy units and certain SMPs, but with that particular focus on most immediate actions, i.e. those that are going to be needed in Epoch 2 and really over that first 10-year period I was mentioning a moment ago. So we've looked at all these and we have a series of recommendations with further detail, but they can be broadly categorized as there are places where the risk management authorities, local authorities, the Environment Agency and so on need to remain aware. Places where some amendments are recommended. Certainly a lot of places where we said there's some action planning needed. For example, studies were supposed to be carried out and they haven't started yet. You really need to be getting on with them because the honeymoon period's over. We've got to get ready for transitioning and thinking about that. And then there are a number of locations. I think there's about 100 across the 1,500 in total, where we're pointing out that probably do need to go and revisit your SMP policy because things have been done differently or things have changed, and it therefore means delivering what it says in the SMP could be problematic. So yeah, let's jump ahead. So accompanying the health checks is the new supplementary guidance as well. We haven't replaced the 2006 guidance, which the SMPs are based upon, but producing information on how to take forward what we've identified within those health checks, next steps, but also how to take account of more knowledge and information going forward over the next few years. Equally, we've also looked at the change process in SMPs as well and looked to modify that so again, giving more guidance to people on how to take this forward. So we'll jump to the next one. I'm hurrying through these deliberately in case the internet goes down again. So the key elements of that guidance is we have this framework for keeping the SMPs live, and there's a lot more explanation in that guidance document about how to take this forward. We will I should probably also say that guidance should be published anytime now. It's with the Environment Agency and DEFRA, and it's just going through their publication process. There's the framework for keeping it live. We have a new structure for action plans. Each SMP has an action plan. Some of those have fallen into disuse. Others are very actively managed. Some have become quite cumbersome. Some are very light touch. Try and get a degree of consistency with those, and an SMP status tracker. Interestingly, it's very difficult to actually find out what the status of an SMP is. These were largely hard copy documents. Changes have taken place, and it's very hard to establish what is now, I suppose, current within those and what isn't. So we set out the tasks and activities to address the findings of the health checks, and we have topic-specific sections. Some of those are how to consider the challenges arising with funding, planning, property loss, designate site and other plans based upon the studies that we've carried out and engagement we've carried out over the past 18 months. But probably two of the key ones are the application and use of management triggers to try and manage or go from this concept of shoreline management plans to shoreline management planning and keeping this live. And the other one was just at the top there was improving policy clarity. Very interesting. One of the most common findings that we've had is through this refresh process is people do not necessarily understand or comprehend the meaning behind some of the labels that exist. Hold the line, managed realignment, no active intervention, and so on. Managed realignment, we understand, was been interpreted in at least 14 different ways. And what one person calls managed realignment is completely different to what someone else calls it. And you'd all, sure, everyone says, well, surely it's simple, but like I said, there's at least 14 different versions of that out there. So we've tried to actually improve that to get greater consistency going forward as well. So this is all the processy type stuff to try and get the SMPs, which are already very good, but consistent, live, and re-energized moving forward. But that's not to say there isn't still an awful long way to go in terms of changing attitudes and thinking about how we really want to manage the coast going forward. And I think those reflections, before my internet goes again, is what Greg is now going to move on to, please. So please, next slide. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, right. So these are very much reflections rather than specific output from the project. You know, and one of the things is, how do we keep the ball rolling? And we found that there is this inertia against change. And in part, that's understanding what the SMP is actually saying, i.e. things like managed realignment, but also the ongoing governance. And hiding away is the uncertainty. You know, we don't quite know what is going to happen all the time. And then specific barriers. How do you actually make adaptation work? And of course, the funding issues. So I think the first thing to recognize is that SMPs have been really used. It's amazing the enthusiasm that we have encountered in doing the health checks, and that they are quite brave. They are not sitting there saying, let's just carry on as we're doing. So comments back are, the SMP still provides a sensible overall framework. The SMP, if people read them, provides a good understanding of the challenges emerging. But there is always a however. There's a resource issue. Even where people are aware of where the SMP is saying we want to go, short-term problems, storm events, tend to drive a firefighting attitude. The focus when we come down to scheme level has the potential to reduce the thinking to a local level, separating that, increasing that separation between policy and what you actually do now. And as Kevin was saying, this strict focus on policy headlines with a tendency for how do you manage that defence, rather than opening the discussion of the wider areas in a more coordinated and adaptive way. And this attitude that SMP is done and dusted, let's move on, wait for SMP whatever, you know, and that to a degree is driven by a pure risk management approach, which is focused on the now. So SMPs, we've done it. Strategies come along, often only looking over 50 years and dealing with the very real issues that they've got now. We've found in many areas strategies undo what the SMP is saying, or say, oh, it's hold the line now, we'll put in a nice rock revetment that'll actually last us 75 years. Whereas actually in Epoch 2, the SMP was saying managed realignment, and then leading into schemes that deliver the immediate policy, but not necessarily feed into the plan. And all the time, there's this danger of parking the problems to the future. Also, if strategies are separate from SMPs and are only looking forward 50 years, it leaves a broader scale, longer term policy vacuum. We lose the awareness of the whole coast, that balance of environmental gain against various other interactions that we need to maintain over the whole area, and hampers the open discussion of things. So we see where we want to go, but we're being held back by the present. An example of this is the action plans, where we got some comments. Most of the work in the action plan is now complete. We're talking about management for the next 100 years and beyond. How can the action plan be complete? So the SMP has always been promoting a different way of thinking, this continuing and continuous approach. So the SMP, broad scale, long-term thinking should always be updating this idea of shoreline management planning, with strategies coming in. Yes, it's got to test the SMP, but the information needs to feed back so that all the time the SMP is providing our structure, anticipating future change, providing this living framework and maintaining that broader scale awareness. The SMP needs to be updated as we move forward, encouraging good debate on where we're going, allowing the uncertainties to be accommodated within a flexible plan, and discussion of the ultimate outcomes, not being overly definitive about the future, but being clear where we are, where we think now we need to be going. And one of the questions I noticed came in about, you know, we're calling SMP2 and SMP1 and things like that. Our attitude is we have a shoreline management plan that will continue to update, and it will become shoreline management planning or shoreline management. And communication is important in this, in getting people to understand, you know, what we're actually talking about. So moving the focus from policies to the intent of management, allowing the SMP to frame the discussion so that we aren't avoiding hard issues, and building a consistency everywhere. It's interesting, Kevin said about these 14 definitions of managed realignment. The SMP says, by allowing the shoreline to move backwards or forwards with management, with the idea of a need for change. We shouldn't be doing what we are doing to achieve a more sustainable form for management of the coast, with the idea that it's identifying the constraints, but also looking at the opportunity and having the discussion of why we need to change. And that's policy level. A recent national document redefined yet again managed realignment as moving or allowing the retreat of the shoreline and the creation of intertidal habitat. That's strategic thinking. That's a strategy level thing. The SMP is saying, we've got to change. Now let's discuss how we change, and maybe highlighting some of the constraints and opportunities in that. So the SMP needs to remain as a clear starting point of where we're going, always anticipating, but always being responsive. If you take this attitude, uncertainty will be built into a progressive SMP approach. SMPs generally, looking at the latest sea level rise figures, the SMP were based on round about 1 metre in 100 years. So from that perspective, what the SMP was saying then was true. It's still valid, but we've now moved forward. And we need to be looking and accommodating the next change in sea level rise, or thinking into the future, so that the whole framework for the SMP is moving forward. We want to get ahead of the game. Monitoring becomes an important aspect of that, but not just looking at what the coast has done, but answering SMP questions, anticipating the change, feeding that back into an ongoing shoreline management with the idea of trigger points. But those trigger points need to then be considered as, what have we got to do before that trigger point arrives? Anticipating. Recognizing always that coastal change is progressive. In erosion and in mean sea level, it is not just recovering from extreme events. On adaptation, that's a presentation in its own right, but just picking up a couple of things, adaptation is happening. SMPs are driving adaptation. Whole variety of places. And an important message coming out is that you're not alone, but each case is different. What we're also seeing and have identified is that half the toolkit is missing, because at a national policy level, how do you actually deliver adaptation measures? Recognizing the length of time it's necessary to engage in discussions, and taking that anticipatory approach that we've got to be discussing these things rather than saying this is what will happen and we'll now wait until it happens. And in communicating this, it's not about the policy, but the reason why the SMP is saying change needs to occur, so that that frames the discussion, getting ahead of the game. Funding is a book in its own right, and in fact there is already one, the Treasury Green Book. It has been a critical consideration in the SMP, but if we look at what the Committee on Climate Change said, around about 150 kilometres of England coastline will not be cost beneficial to protect or adapt as currently planned, with the conclusion that the SMPs were actually leading us down the wrong way. But that was based purely on a risk perspective of risk to the properties that there are now. So it's correct in context, but not from a wider perspective. Similarly, and this recognizing that it's the National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy, so risk management, talks about partnership funding, opportunity to invest in coastal erosion risk management measures. From the SMP perspective, we've got to step back in part from that. It's looking at that risk management, which is important, but also seeing how that ties into the bigger picture. So from an SMP perspective, rather than a purely risk management, the opportunity to bring together coastal management, taking into account the risk, but to deliver a sustainable, affordable vision for the coast. With the caveat that we've got to be careful with the partnership funding and short-term funding, because that, if someone is willing to pay, we've got to actually test that at the broader level to make sure that just because they can pay for it now, it isn't actually driving us down a dead end. So I think that concludes, and we have a few minutes for thoughts and questions, please.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks both for the presentation.
Shall
We've had quite a few.
I'll let you. I'll hand back control.
So I've got some comments that have come in on the chat box that everybody can see. But in the actual Q&A, I've got two currently at the moment. So yeah, if anybody's got questions, please feel free to add them into the Q&A box. We'll answer them in order as they come in. So first question we've got, is there a danger that applying the subcategory policy guidance could lead to different policies within the existing policy unit frontages?
I can answer that one. I suppose the question is it a danger? If the policy's not right, does it need to change? However, a bit flippant, but we've been quite careful about this in that we have produced guidance on expanding the descriptions of the existing headlines, because we're conscious that once we have a change in policy, there's a whole process to go through, including public engagement and consultation. So these are more elaborations than changes, in part because the headline policy label says one thing, but when you read the narrative in the policy unit statements, they are often nuanced in some way or another. So we're actually bringing that nuancing and that intent of that policy to the fore, rather than it being buried away where nobody sees it. So no, they won't be changing them. However, so we've facilitated that. However, we have also pointed out that there is a lot of overlap. There's a good example of something like dune management, sand dune management, where almost the identical description and use is labelled under hold the line, manage realignment, and no active intervention in existing SMPs. We've enabled that to still continue just for the first pass of relabelling, but recommended as and when any policies are revisited, you go down the one single descriptor, and again, there's guidance on that.
I would just add to that, if you think about coastal change management areas, the guidance on that suggests that if you've got a hold the line frontage, you don't need to worry about coastal change. Whereas the SMPs, there are many hold the line frontages where the SMP is saying something will still change. You may get increased flood risk, things like that. And therefore, it's just clarifying, making sure that we don't sort of just use those policy headlines, and we're really thinking about what we're doing.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'll answer the second question now as well, which is the UK has a high ratio of coastline to land mass, suggesting that shoreline management might be especially important to us. Does that mean that we're ahead of other parts of the world in our thinking? If we're working elsewhere in the world, what can we expect to find in terms of management planning compared to what we have here? Well, I think one of the shoreline management plans and the concept is something which has actually been exported around the world. And a lot of the world, it might sound a bit arrogant from UK PLC perspective, but I think it has been seen in many parts of the world as world leading. And some of those principles are being adopted and maybe adapted in other parts of the world as well. We've certainly seen instances of that. Certainly in good places like Australia, they are interestingly doing it, but from my understanding, they don't start from the position of, right, we need to hold the line, what else do we do? They start from the position, right, we may need to adapt, what do we do? And it's sort of like holding the line is about third or fourth on the list, not first on the list. But no, it's certainly been exported. It has been adapted and adopted in other parts of the world. So people do things differently, but I think the principles are getting out there. So
next one is coming back to coastal change management.
I was going to pass to you, yes, on that one.
Yeah, we've, as part of the refresh process, we have said, you know, does this need to be an area where you're looking at coastal change management? Sorry, whatever, CCMA. And yeah, but we're also highlighting that it isn't just from the perspective of stopping development, that's important, but it should also be looking at how is that change going to affect the whole community. So reducing it down to a, you know, a very local level. If the SMP is saying that you're going to lose your main car park in an important tourist area, that may be the only thing at risk, but that is going to have a fundamental change on the way in which that community functions. And therefore, we feel coastal change management areas need to be looking at an impact and outcomes rather than being defined by hard lines of how far will erosion occur over the next 100 years. Right?
Yep.
Four policies rather than...
Oh, can I answer this one, Greg?
Whoa. Well, I argued for 2 policies.
I've argued for
none. Sorry to interrupt. May I please ask that you read out the question just in case all of our audience isn't looking at the Q&A box?
Yep.
Thank you.
My apologies.
The next question was Fiona, wasn't it? Yeah. So are you reading it out, Anya, or do you want us to?
I'm happy for you to. I was just going to say, yeah, as you answer, good to read them out so everyone, in case people aren't looking. Yeah.
So I like this question. Do you think there should have been more than 4 policy options to give the wider variety needed? Greg said he'd argued for 2. And my personal view is there shouldn't have been more, there should have been none. It should be 0. And the reason I say that is because we argued this at the time of the 2006 guidance when we wrote it, which was saying, as soon as you do this, that's all people focus on. And lo and behold, you can go to any part of the country and people say, oh, we've got a hold the line policy here. And, you know, walk away from it more or less. And certainly from the public and from a number of local developers, this has been right pain in the backside, to put it bluntly. Because what happens is people read those 3 little words or 4 little words at the top and never go and look at actually the detail of the policy unit statement and say, what do you actually intend to do here? So I would argue what we needed was a statement of what do you actually plan to do here? What's the direction you want to go? Once those labels appeared, people haven't read the statements. So
can I pick up on Steve McFarlane's one?
Do you want to read it out as well?
Yeah. If you had a piece of coast with no current SMP, what should be the key considerations to develop long-term sustainable set of policies, and what role should the local communities play in that policy development? Yes, it's interesting because although there was a lot of consultation that did happen on the SMPs, we're conscious and have identified in the refresh that we need to be going out and we need to be talking more with communities. I would say that, almost picking up from what Kevin was saying about the policy units, if you start from, so how's the coast behaving? What's at risk? What needs to change? How do you need to adapt? And really facing up to those issues, the SMP can then frame a sensible discussion with the communities without having predefined the policy. So they don't get hung up on managed realignment. Oh, that's going to mean that we've got to, abandon everything. It's what is actually going to happen if we do carry on in the way in which we are doing. Now, let's, from that basis, start discussing with local communities where we're going. I had a situation where there was a lot of opposition to putting in managed realignment on a bit of coast because people thought that it was abandoning everything. When we actually explained to people that basically their coast was in the wrong position and was constraining the opportunities, we actually ended up, a scheme was developed that we moved the defence back. We created a new area, far more sustainable, that we were then able to develop some fairly great ideas as to how that area works, and it's contributed into the regeneration of an area that was otherwise just somewhere you didn't park your car because it would get rather wet.
That probably leads on nicely to the final question about which we've got here, is how do we plan to bring stakeholders along with you in the refresh? And I think that sometimes the problem is the fear of the unknown, and actually there can be alternatives to doing what we do at the moment, which are actually better than what we have at the moment. But as for regards to the refresh project specifically, what we have done already is we did a key stakeholders. One of the key stakeholders, of course, in all of this is the risk management authorities, the local authorities, the Environment Agency, and a number of other parties with a ownership of land or strong interest in the coastline, natural environment, and so on included. So we've had an engagement process through the refresh, which has involved a series of forums. We went on a roadshow late last year to meet them, discuss what they saw as the issues for their part of the coast, and in particular things that have changed since the SMP and difficulties with maybe delivering the SMP, but also what went well. And we should put this back into context. The SMPs are great, in many regards. They've brought people together that weren't being brought together before the SMPs existed. They've got people talking about the issues at the coast in a way that they can also be addressed. That wasn't happening before the SMPs existed, at least not to this extent. We've also, when we did the refresh, ran a series of focus groups on particular subject matters to try and bring the right expertise into place. But then going forward, the stakeholders are a huge part of it, particularly when it comes to the public and communities and local businesses and an awful lot of the actions and the next steps that we have put into the health check reports are around the need for that sort of engagement to take place. I have to say now, our job in that regard is done. We are flagging up what those next steps could and should be, but really now is handing those over. That's the interim step, handing those back now to the authorities to say, we've carried out this semi-independent review for you. This is what we found, but it's really up to you now collectively to decide what you want to do with this, and we shall see how that goes. Greg mentioned there's resource constraints. It is difficult with people's availability, funding, and so on. But again, the Environment Agency have been looking at seeking further funding to help support those authorities in taking this forward, having invested in doing this refresh. So there is a plan to certainly engage stakeholders. Is a big part of what we've put forward. We shall see how it goes. That sounds like the end of questions then.
Yes, I think that's all we've got at the moment. So yeah, as I said in the last one, if you anyone has any further questions, feel free to I don't know how Kevin and Greg, if you'd rather the questions came to me, I'm happy to share my email and pass them on and link people up. So my email is anya.fisher@wsp.com. So yeah, more than happy for additional thoughts and questions to be passed on. And just yeah, another thank you to you both for taking the time to present, and thank you everyone for turning up. And yes, keep your eyes peeled for our rescheduled presentation that's meant to be tomorrow. We'll hopefully get that done the next month or so. So thank you once again for everybody, and have a good rest of your day.
And apologies for BT's internet quality.
That's great. Oh yes, the recording. Oh yeah, just seeing recording be available in 48 hours. So yeah, keep a lookout for that as well. All right, lovely. Thank you very much all.
Bye then.
Cheers. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.